Welcome to Therapist Uncensored, a podcast where therapists freely speak their minds about real-life matters.
Hi, welcome to Therapist Uncensored. This is episode 75. I'm Ann Kelly, and my co-host Sue Marriott and I are currently working on season 3. We think it's going to be fabulous, and in that endeavor, we are taking some time, so we're going to be replaying some of our most popular episodes, especially on topics that we feel are so pertinent to our overall message on this podcast of spreading security inside us, between us, and in our community. So to that end, today's episode couldn't be more perfect. It is with Dr. Dan Siegel, who is really the father of interpersonal neurobiology. And if you don't know what interpersonal neurobiology is, you will by the end of this episode, and it will matter to you. Sue Marriott, and by the way, Patty Olwell does this interview. Patty Olwell is our co-host in our first season. So she's no longer on the podcast, but we loved having her for our first season, and she's on this episode, so you'll enjoy that. And Dan Siegel is basically an international acclaimed author of so many books that we couldn't even list. His more recent book, Mind, A Journey to the Heart of Being Human, is something that's really on his mind in this podcast. So you will hear about that because he's really talking about the current political and international and climate crisis that we seem to be in worldwide, and talk about the high potential in this state of threat to live in fear and alarm in our bodies, and how much that can be a detriment to us as individuals, our relationships, as well as our community. In this episode, Dr. Siegel talks about transforming this time to be a chance for more human connection. So it's really a timely piece, and he really gives some beautiful insights that I think you're going to really enjoy. For those of you that name is familiar, but that book isn't, you might think he also does one of the best parenting books that I recommend. I think Sue does too. And that is Parenting from the Inside Out. Love that book. No Drama, Discipline. There's a couple of just books that he's been able to accomplish or co-author. So I'm going to turn it over to the interview. They've just basically invited Dan to just discuss what's on the top of his mind. So that's where we jump in.
We have been telling you that we were going to be interviewing Dr. Dan Siegel. And today is the day. We started the interview by inviting Dan to share what was on the top of mind for him as we embarked on the discussion.
So in terms of me right now, first of all, it's great to be here with you, Sue and Patty, and it's great to remember that time when we were in person together in Austin. To be here right now on the podcast, I would just say, there's been so much communication that I've received either directly or just in the general news of how the world is doing, that I guess I'm just filled with a feeling of sort of being a little sad and a little enthusiastic and hopeful all at the same time. So I went for a walk with my dog in this beautiful mountains we have just outside of Santa Monica, and did some meditation up there, and was looking at the trees and the bushes and the wildlife that were there, and just feeling how close you could feel to nature, but how distant we often feel. And I've been reading a book called Sapiens, and so I'm filled with the beginning of that book, which is kind of about our evolutionary history as a species. And so I was just feeling kind of sad about, that our evolution has been so violent, that we killed all of our close, not just cousins, but even brothers and sisters, and even, continue to do that as a species. So anyway, I said if there's anything, it's not so much what's going on in my family or anything like that, but it's more in the large global and historical context. And I was talking with some folks who are doing a big project in Baltimore, where I've been doing some work just about all the violence that's there, and how to try to really bring community together and give people across the whole socioeconomic status just a way to feel belonging, and to kind of deal directly with a lot of these I think, very painful realities of our human evolution. So on the one hand, that's part of me is filled with the heaviness of that and, all the things that have been going on in these last few weeks, with the world, but also thinking, how can we use these moments of challenge in politics and economics and climate change to do what one of the directors of the World Health Organization's departments of public health, Maria Neira, says, while, you can look at climate change challenges as really horrible crises, which of course in some ways they're also an opportunity to see how to improve human health. So I see the current situation as a moment to do what Arthur Zients calls, try to empower people with something called pervasive leadership, how to give individuals the knowledge and not just the information, but the transformation to really take integration, the idea of creating more kindness and compassion in the world, and, living that, not just talking about it, but actually living it. So anyway, that's a lot to cover, but you asked me, so that's kind of what my morning's been like. So it's a pleasure to be here, but that's it. Those are the things I've been sitting with.
Well, and it's a great lead into your book. I heard you had some really good news today, that you're going to be on the New York Times science list.
Yeah, that was great news, because it's a pretty deep and, nothing left out book. So it wasn't like a book I tried to make for popular, consumption. So I was very happy to hear that enough people were interested enough to give it a try that it got on the New York Times Science Extended list. So that was great. I mean, it's a wonderful thing. It's especially wonderful because the way things tend to work is, if someone sees that on a sign or on a cover of the book, or then they'll say, oh, well, maybe I'll think about reading it. So it made me feel like the book would be just a little more accessible, perhaps, because of that. So it's a good feeling to know something will support it. Yeah, that's great news. Interpersonal neurobiology is both a set of information, but also a kind of journey that we're all on together. So I love the name of the beginning of it, especially the interpersonal part, because it's the idea that the inter is something between us, the personal is something within us. And if I had to do a quick elevator speech about the Mind book, it's really a book, The Mind, A Journey to the Heart of Being Human book, is really trying to focus on how one thing, the mind, can be both within us and between us. So it takes the word interpersonal really and looks at how the mind can be in these seeming two places, but in the end, they're just one place. And that's why, like, when I was sitting with the breeze, my dog next to me, just feeling the sun and just noticing the trees kind of waving back and forth in the breeze, I could feel that, this body that we get to be born in is just a temporary part of a much larger identity we have. And to feel that is the part of the betweenness, of what the mind is. So interpersonal neurobiology, the neurobiology word is just the idea of science, so we take all the sciences and combine them into one framework. And, it sounds so sophisticated, but the thing that I think you probably know at Austin and Connection is, it's actually quite simple. And though there's, a lot to take in when you combine math and physics and chemistry, biology, psychology, sociology, anthropology, linguistics, and put them all together, in the end, the message you get is actually quite simple. And this is what I think makes it so exciting. So you can apply it in psychotherapy, in parenting, in education, in organizational functioning, in meditation. It's so amazing that it has these applications for informing people and then letting the people be empowered themselves in whatever those settings to take it for their own. So whether it's, I was teaching 2 weeks ago, right before the election, at a meditation retreat for 3 days with Mathieu Ricard, and he asked me to teach in some of this stuff. And so I was teaching an interpersonal neurobiology view of consciousness, and or you could teach to this group in Baltimore where we had 600 people who were from all walks of the community gathering together. We'd been having dinners together and had to think about what our identity is. Or you could be talking to scientists like I did just the other day at UC Santa Barbara, where you want to talk about what is the relationship between mind and brain and how does consciousness fit into all that. So it's just really exciting to be on a journey with all of you.
It's interesting that you brought up identity, because I loved the story in the book about your horse ride in Mexico and the fall that gave you that interesting insight into the sort of two parts of yourself.
Yeah.
Do you want to expand a little on that?
Sure. So, and this is part of, when I was deciding to choose this topic for the Mind book, when you write a book, there's always the question like, well, how am I going to write this book? I got the topic, but like, what's the process? So I wanted the book to be very relational, and I felt like to talk about this issue of my horse accident, to just put that out of context and just say, oh, I had a horse accident, and here's what my experience was. I felt the whole book needed to be inviting the reader into a kind of deep conversation about the fact that we do have subjective experience. And there was this kind of hilarious but also sad review of the book that came out, and the first sentence says something like, Siegel believes subjective experience is important in his book Mind. And now the next sentence is, neuroscience has proven that subjective experience doesn't exist.
Whoa.
And I thought, wow, what person actually believes that subjective experience doesn't exist? And then even if they believed it, do they really think they would think that neuroscience has proven that it doesn't exist, which it hasn't? So, there is this whole thing about objective science where you can take a stance and say, I've got to measure everything and observe everything and usually quantify things. And, so science tries to do that. And I'm trained as a scientist. Believe me, I know how to do that kind of stuff. So I felt for the book, if we're talking about the mind, that it had to be a book where I had to be present in my own subjective experience to invite the reader to explore hers, or his, and to honor that, And so before I ever wrote a single word of the book, I felt, I'd have to take the risk of having each chapter be leading off with subjective experience to, make it an invitation to show that that's real and ask the reader what's their subjective experience. So, but I know when you do that, it's always risky because people can say, oh, you're writing a memoir or you're writing whatever, which is not a memoir. I mean, it's not about my parents or anything, or my family. It's nothing like that.
Well, I felt like it by giving your own personal examples, you really gave concrete examples that made it much easier to understand the book, I thought.
I'm so happy to hear that, Patty. And because it's a risky thing when you do that. You feel much more vulnerable. And I know when I turned in the manuscript, my daughter helped me with this. For the first time ever, I started losing sleep. I couldn't sleep. And it was right the day I pressed send on the manuscript. And, and I think it's because of the vulnerability I felt. But so in terms of your question about this horse accident, this was a time when I was almost 20 years old, and I was working for the World Health Organization in Mexico studying folk healers, and I had to go on an assignment up this mountain ridge to go down into this place called Huautla, where there was one of the most renowned folk healers was there, and I was interviewing all of them in the region. Anyway, so one morning when I went with two of my colleagues, actually one young boy who lived in the house I was living in, and a colleague of mine with the World Health Organization, we were going up this path, And I'm a pretty good horse rider, but unfortunately I forgot the lesson that I don't even remember learning, actually, that, after you're riding for a minute or two, you're supposed to get off your horse and tighten the saddle, because very sophisticated horses will float their abdomen up with air so that the saddle won't be so tight when they start walking, Anyway, so the bottom line is this happened, and this saddle got loose, and at a full gallop, the saddle slipped and, went to the horse's belly, and my feet stayed in the stirrups, so I was dragged for a long, long way, and it was pretty terrifying. I destroyed my face and lost my teeth and broke my nose and all sorts of things. And anyway, but the biggest thing in terms of the book wasn't all that stuff, but it was that I had what you could call basically transient, because it was temporary, but we didn't know it at the time, global, meaning it was kind of total amnesia. I had no idea who I was. And that can happen from, having your head banged on rocks for about 100 yards, as a scared horse is running at full speed. Anyway, they thought I was dead, but I wasn't dead. They thought I had broken my neck, given you can imagine what it looked like to the others, but I hadn't broken my neck. So, but I did lose my identity. So the strange thing was, for this, it was about a day, I was wide awake, and I was, I remember it. I mean, that's the strange thing. I mean, I was wide awake, so things like giving me a glass of water, I wouldn't know how to say the word glass or water or anything like that, but, they'd give me a glass of water, and it was like this magical, wild experience of light shimmering and holding this cool thing on my fingers and just sort of kind of blissing out on this kind of cool feeling, and then the water kind of shimmering, and then it goes in your mouth, and I didn't have teeth, but I mean, it just passed through all those, whatever was left there, teeth. And so...
Like you were a child, just kind of seeing things
exactly.
For the first time.
It was totally child mind, exactly. And, what was magical about it was, as my identity came back after the 24 hours, things stopped being so vivid. They stopped being so crystalline. And, I've never had the experience of using hallucinogens, but people who have told me, it sounds like you're on this drug or that drug. And, which maybe creates that same neurological impediments that I had. But the most important thing for me was, besides the wild ride of sensory experience, was the idea that if knocking your head around could literally knock out your sense of a personal identity, but you were wide awake and aware, maybe even more awake and aware, then what does identity do to our awakeness, to our awareness? And so when I use phrases like, your awareness or awaken your mind, it's the idea that there is this level of identity, this level of reality, this level of experience beneath identity. And in many ways, it relates to the idea that, there's something called the burden of expertise, which is that the more experience and knowledge you attain,
totally get that,
the less you see.
Yes.
So that's the weird thing. So that's what that chapter was about. Like, who are we? And, if you could knock identity out, well, what is your identity beneath that? And yeah, there's some amazing things that you can talk about that.
It makes me think of actually an example you had used before of even just a dog, and that we see a dog, but that if you can see a tail and fur and ears and shadow, you know what I mean? Like, exactly. It's rediscovering. And, the way that I think of that is like, that's a way to fall in love again. If you can do that with your partner.
Totally. I think that's exactly right. And, this morning I was with my dog and up just feeling the breeze and watching the leaves rustle in the wind and this big, beautiful canyon. I could, and you can learn to do this, you can drop beneath words like tree, wind, breeze, oh, isn't this great? All that kind of witnessing chatter. but you can train yourself to drop into this, I call it the hub of the mind, this wheel, but you can train yourself to have life become much more vibrant. And that's where, for me as a clinician, educator, science person, and just person on the planet, I really wanted to understand how we could understand it and then how we could create more of that vitality in life,
Well, and you bring up earlier, you had mentioned the election and the national conversation right now. And, most of what I hear you teach about is building compassion and kindness. And how do we teach that in our educational systems with kids and build those circuits in our neural networks? And how do we heal from this? How do we stop the damage? How do we do you have thoughts?
Yeah, it's a great question, Sue. And I do believe very deeply that it's important to empower each individual to have the strength within herself or himself to, really see what values in life are important and, in a way, develop a kind of spaciousness beneath all the informational input we get from, the news and from internet sources and social media and all those things. And, especially for the young generation that are so externally focused, I think it's really vitally important. So, in terms of integration and all of that, I find it helpful, and I remember I did a podcast right before the election, where what we talked about was, this value of understanding all the different layers of our experience. And this one particular layer that I talked about, I'll talk about here, because I think it relates to what we need to understand about the planet, which is, we were born into a body, and in that body, there's all sorts of evolutionary propensities that this body we're born into has. Now, we have a mind that's not the same as the body. It is influenced by the body, including its brain. But luckily, it's something that I believe, and this is why I wrote the book Mind, that it isn't just the same as brain activity. Now, just putting that on the side for a moment, even if it is completely dependent on the brain, the hierarchical level, the more complex level of energy information flow from which the mind is arising is something that can turn back and shape the brain itself. And that becomes really important when we look at this evolutionary reality, which is, as I was mentioning about in the Sapiens book, you can see this, but you just look at our studies of what's called mortality salience or terror management studies. What we know is that we've evolved to have in our brain this focus on evaluating or assessing who is in the in group that are people that are our kin or that are like us, and then who are the people in our out group. So in the Sapiens book, the way they look at this is our history not so long ago is that we became part of being human about 2 million years ago, and there were a number of human species running around. So different genus of Homo, which is the human part. Now, usually animals of the same genus but different species cannot mate. But there's evidence now, in 2010, we have evidence that in fact some Homo sapiens, our modern human beings, in fact did mate with different groups of other genuses, so that some people have, for example, the DNA of Neanderthals in their systems and other people don't. And people in other countries have other genuses, not the Neanderthals. So this is an important...
That's the best explanation I've heard so far.
So this is just important to... So that's one thing. But then those other genuses, as of I think about 30,000 years ago, they're all gone. Now, there's two theories. We may have completely mated with them and intermingled, but then you would imagine that there'd be much more, a higher percentage. It's only about 1%, 2%, or in Australia it's about 6%, of the DNA would be more, of the other groups, but maybe not. So that's one theory, is we just mated with everybody. Everyone had this massive cross-genus, cross-species, mating, and then we were all one Homo sapiens and the others disappeared. But the other theory is that, we wiped out people not like us. But in any event, as of about, 30,000 years ago, 70,000 years ago, something happened where Homo sapiens started leaving Africa, because they came from the eastern side of Africa and then down to South Africa and Namibia, where actually I was there just recently interviewing people about their mind sight abilities, because they're the ancestors of our probably original grandparents, if you will, of Homo sapiens. So about 70,000 years ago, some left and they started going all around the place. But when they did that, there was a lot of change in the environment, and we now know that the way we survived was to figure out who is in your in-group and who's in your out-group. And so this survival-based way we evolved, with our genetic propensities then informing how the brain circuitry is developing, is deep, deep, deep in our history for literally tens of thousands of years. So in the last 10,000 years, we have all sorts of things are evolving, and we're built with these practices. I mean, even to the point where I was talking to Steve Suomi, who's a monkey researcher, where probably for 50 million years, our primate cousins have demonstrated also that they can turn on out-group family members, even in the same troop, and completely destroy them. So it isn't just for 2 million years, and it's not just for the 70,000 years that Homo sapiens were running around the planet, going everywhere. But it looks like it may be 50 million years. So the bottom line, whatever the number is, it's been a long,
it's deeply embedded,
deeply embedded in our primate. Let's just put it there, primate history. So.
And just to be clear, I think some of what you're taught, just for our listeners, is this capacity for mind sight and empathy and compassion that we can have, but that we can turn off.
Exactly.
When we are not recognizing someone as one of us, and when they are an other. And there are some of it, that can be a willful act, or even an act that we're not aware of doing, but we just aren't able to have resonance with someone, and so we turn off that sense of empathy.
Exactly. So Sue, this is exactly right. That at one time, we evolved. On the one hand, we've evolved for lots of reasons, but they involved us being upright and not on all fours. They involve the fact that the brain of the genus Homo, that is us humans, was just much, much, much bigger than other apes. And that this bigger brain meant that if the woman was going to survive when this baby came out, the baby had to come out premature, really, not able to take care of herself, like a guinea pig that comes out and starts eating grass pretty much right away. You have this... or maybe not eating grass, but running around. You have this history then of this little baby you have to take care of, where the brain is using up so much energy that you have to collaborate to take care of a baby. It takes a village, So then we had to collaborate to have our young survive. And now this is over a long, long history. So at least whether it's our Homo group, which is about 2 million years old, or Homo sapiens, which are at least 70,000 years old, maybe it's probably in its long existence 200,000 years. But you have this collaboration. So on the one hand, we collaborate with people that we deem in our in-group. They could be our family members, they could be our tribe members, they could be people in our cave, they could be people nowadays in our religion. And And then we do have this capacity, Sue, just like you're saying, where on the one hand we have mind-sight skills to see the mind of another who's in our in-group and say, what does that person need? How can I give them what they need? How can I take care of their baby? How can we really collaborate? How can we be connected? Beautiful. Really, really beautiful. But at the same time, we also have this out-group response, which is to, as you're saying, shut off the mind-sight circuitry, see the other, and Elizabeth Lesser calls this othering, this othering process shuts off mind-sight circuits. Literally, it says that is just dirt, and I want to sweep the dirt from my little hut here.
Build a wall away from it.
And you have this unbelievable history of Homo sapiens being filled with genocide. That we as a species will take out-group people, don't see that they have a mind, a subjective experience, and wipe them out. Mm-hmm. So now, here's the thing about the
is there hope?
Well, I think there is hope, but let's talk about the not so hopeful thing. The terror management studies show, just so we know the facts, these are studies where you show like a subliminal photograph, like less than 250 milliseconds to somebody, and so they don't know consciously they've seen it, but if it's a photograph of, let's say, a gun pointing at you or a terrible car accident versus a photograph like of a meadow or people smiling and holding hands. This is a control group, right? So people don't know what they saw, but you show it to them. When you've induced a state of terror and they don't know why, they will treat in-group people in a much kinder way and out-group people in a much more hostile way, more harsher way. And I think that's what's been happening, not just in the United States, but it's happening through Europe. It explains Brexit. It explains what's going on with the horrible things happening everywhere, even in Africa, in parts of Asia now. I mean, it's just, the impending genocides that are all around this country are just, they're not just random. It isn't just, these aren't bad people. These are human beings. These are Homo sapiens.
Scared people.
That are scared, right? And I'm not trying to defend them, but so you say, what do we do to rise above it? We have to, and this is where interpersonal neurobiology comes in. When we're able to see the mind as not just brain activity, what it gives us as educators, clinicians, people who run organizations, people who run countries, people who are, in the position to raise children with this, it allows you to have the mind say the following thing. My nervous system is making me treat this person as an out-group member with more hostility, but this goes against my larger values that all human beings, in fact, all living beings, need to be treated with deep respect, just like I would treat the in-group. So I'm going to do a practice, and mindfulness practices, for example, have been shown to decrease implicit racial bias. Doing all sorts of compassion training allows you to rise above your brain's initial proclivity and use your mind to actually change the way your brain ultimately will carry out behavior, even if you have an initial response, oh, that person's in the out group and I don't see their mind. You can actually rise above that. So.
That's really interesting, and I think your book too,
relieving,
is really hopeful, because especially the parts on integration talk about the drive towards wellness and the drive towards health and the sort of self-organizing principles of our mind. Do you want to expand on that a little?
Yeah. Well, thanks, Patty. It's certainly possible to get doom and gloomy and just say, wow, this is pretty bad. We have pretty horrible evolutionary history, and my God, things are getting just more intense, so what's the point? I don't feel that way. I feel very hopeful and very optimistic, and I know there's a lot of work for all of us to do, and this is why the idea from Arthur Zients of pervasive leadership, that everybody has the ability to be empowered to take leadership here. So when you think about the mind, and you're pointing out kind of the proposal that if you see the mind as this emergent, self-organizing aspect of a complex system. Now that's just from math. I know people don't like math, but this is where you turn to say, how is what happens within us connected to what happens between us? So for me, the only way to do that was to turn to complex systems and to look then at one aspect of these complex systems, which are the emergent processes, which include self-organization. So then you say, well, a self-organizing emergent process that's both embodied and relational may be what the mind is, but then what does it do? So then you say, well, what it does is it regulates energy and information flow, and that's also where it's arising from. That's the emergent part. But then it turns back and regulates that from which it arose. So it's kind of counterintuitive, but it's scientifically grounded. And then you say, well, how do I optimize self-organization? And then you come up with this absolutely simple but solidly scientific view, which is that when you've impaired self-organization, you go to chaos or rigidity. And when you optimize self-organization, you go to harmony. You go to this, things you two know about, flexibility, adaptability, FA. C is coherence, which is a math term for resilient, basically. Energized and stable, it spells the word faces. And so you get this incredible definition of well-being, faces, flexible, adaptive, coherent, energized, and stable. It's like that optimal flow of a river that comes, you say, well, how? How do I make self-organization become optimal? And then it becomes really simple again. You differentiate, you have different parts of a system become specialized or different. That's what differentiate means. And then you connect them, you link them. So linking differentiated parts of a system is what we're going to call integration. Mathematicians don't use the term, but we can use that term. So integration is where you honor differences and you promote linkages, and it creates, we're going to say, well-being. So the exciting thing about that definition for our political times is you can say a government should be promoting honoring of differences across gender, across sexual orientation, across sexual identity, across races, across religions, and then honoring those differences and promoting respectful, compassionate communication. That would be an integrated way a civilization can operate. And I believe very deeply it is possible to do that. It's a really simple set of guidelines, if you will. If you use integration as your starting place, you can look at, let's say, the racial violence that's been going on in this country as part of the chaos that's been happening. You can look at the rigid polarity of political views that happen even within families as the rigidity. And we are in a state of impaired self-organization as a society in many, many places. And what we want to do is look at what is not integrated in our society, and you can kind of see it. There isn't much honoring of differences, and there isn't much linkage through compassionate communication.
Well, and it's actually interesting because when you try to speak to honoring difference and things like that, right now what is the dominant culture is to have that voice be shamed and belittled and humiliated, that softer compassion. So it poses its own unique challenges, but it also even happens, I think, internally with not left and right, I know is too simple, but the system of, what is, in simple terms, the left brain dominating the right brain process, that we sort of have that nationally as well. I think.
Yeah, I think, Sue, I think it's a really good and complex point you're making, and it's worth maybe trying to tease that apart because, we live in very challenging times. I mean, we really do. To put it simply, there's too many human beings on the planet. And we've created a society, modern society, based on consumerism that its foundations are continued growth, production and consumption. And if there isn't continued growth, there's economic collapse. So I don't want to get us all feeling down, but there's a fundamental problem with the way the word profit, Profit, profit has been defined, because it's based on continually taking resources from the planet, turning them into junk, having people want the junk, and then the junk breaks apart, so you have to buy more junk. And then basically, in modern society, the idea is, well, the way I achieve a sense of happiness is I get as much junk as I can, and then you get 100 units of junk and you feel unhappy and meaningless. So then you say, well, probably I need 500 units of junk. You
billion units of junk.
Yeah, and then you get 1 billion units. So you can see that there's just a basic fatal flaw in the structure of modern views on profit. And also there's a fatal flaw, I think, that's been around for 2,500 years, since the time of Hippocrates, on defining the self as coming from the mind, of course, which in Hippocrates' view, 2,500 years ago, was only from the brain. And modern psychology, with William James, perpetuated that view. The mind is just from the brain. And so the outcome of that view on modern science, for sure, but also the society, is that we're all separate. Mm-hmm. And when you're all separate, basically, I think what happens is, it is so wrong. I mean, Einstein called it an optical delusion, not even an illusion, but an optical delusion of consciousness, a psychotic belief. And I really feel
separateness is the optical delusion.
The separateness, that you are a completely separate being from other people or nature or the universe. So, I mean, part of why I wrote the Mind book was to say, let's look at the scientific view that is commonly held, that mind is what brain does. And let's see if maybe, even though we've held that view for 2,500 years, even though it's politically incorrect, let's actually question it and say, if it's not just brain activity, what might the mind be? And if the self comes from the mind, then who are we, And as you go through this scientific reasoning, and that's why the book is not, a self-help book or anything. It can be helpful to yourself, but it's more like a deep dive into, who we are, what the mind is. So when you get to that, you say, well, an integrated self, if that's what the mind is all about, is self-organization, then you say, well, you've got a me in a body, but you've got a we in your connection to other people and the planet, to nature. So how do you integrate a self? And then it comes to the conclusion, you don't get rid of the me, you cultivate an inner me, and so you can liberate yourself, for example, from in-group, out-group distinctions. But at the same time, you also honor our connections as a we. And, in doing that, you come up with this idea of we, MWE. And what's been so moving for me, going around the country, in fact, going around the world, having the opportunity to meet with people in workshops and conferences. And I often end the talk with the idea of an integrated identity as a we, but it fights against what we've been told for 2,500 years. But we can turn the course of cultural evolution around if we take a deep breath and say, something, the course we've been on in modern society, fueled by the idea of a separate self as the mind is thought of as just brain activity, fueled by a view of profit as only coming from manufacturing and selling junk, that there's a deeper kind of what the Greeks called eudaimonia, a life of meaning and connection and equanimity that doesn't come from producing and consuming junk, Mm-hmm. But that's the world we have. So literally, and this is going to be the challenge, and it's not going to just be a 4-year term of one president or another. It's literally got to be a groundswell of pervasive leadership where people start living this way to another sense of reality, And when I teach in high schools and I talk to the parents about how I understand they're so worried about whether their kid will have a job or not, or whether their kid will start Facebook, the next Facebook or not, or, they just want the best for their child. They want to protect their little child as they get ready to launch out from high school. I said, but they've locked onto a number, like an SAT score or a GPA or the low level of acceptance rate to an elite college. And they believe falsely, but they believe that somehow getting your kid into that school is going to guarantee anything, but it doesn't. And then I say to them, here's the problem. You've got a higher suicide rate now. You've got unbelievable stress and anxiety. And these kids who buy into that, they actually are being taught a complete lie. And it's a lethal lie. So, I mean, part of this whole interpersonal neurobiology mindset stuff is to say, let's take a deep step back. Let's embrace the studies of anthropology. You know, let's look what Margaret Mead said, you know, that don't ever think a small group of people can't change the world, because in fact, it's the only thing that ever has. And we have to embrace that anthropological wisdom and say, cultural evolution is not based on genes, it's based on memes, you know, ideas. And so part of what I love being in a member of a community, the interpersonal neurobiology community, is, you know, we're not a form of therapy. We may inform therapy, but we're a way of understanding what it means to be human. And so in all these different avenues of human life, therapy, education, parenting, organizations, government, all that kind of stuff, we need to work together to have this science-based view of where cultural evolution might be able to go. And I'm actually really hopeful that we can start turning it around. I really am.
Well, I love to hear the hope. And, you know, as you're talking, I'm thinking both, you know, the country and culturally, and I love your talk of ancient history, but I'm also thinking at the couples level and you know, integration and this hope and the we related to people's individual lives and the sort of just the practical. So when you're mad at your husband, being able to, and if he were shaming to you, you know, that being able to ground yourself first and be less concerned with what he's doing. And I'm just sort of trying to do a fast translation of how I'm interpreting it, which is like going inward first and getting that for yourself to then be able to move back out and make those connections to the world. But
well, Sue, you know, I think that's really true. In our society, modern society, we do have this big emphasis on a separate self. So then when you look at couples therapy, you say, well, here's person A and person B, and they've gotten together as a couple. So their A is in relationship to B, B is in relationship to A, and all that stuff. So what I hear you saying, and I feel so strongly too about it, is for couples therapy, where's the A-B? You know, where's the we?
Right.
That emerges, and that joining, you know, is it's not something that's encouraged so much, you know, and I think letting go, and you know, this comes back to, you know, Patty, what you asked about the horse accident, you know, letting go of the separate identity being only what you have. Of course, you have a body. And your body's got about 100 years. Of course, you have a body which had an attachment history that you should make sense of in your coherent adult attachment interview. And of course, you have a body that you should sleep well and feed well and exercise well. Yes, yes, yes. So we're not saying there's no separate self. We're saying there isn't an only separate self. That's the key thing. And so we want to make sure we hold on to the me. The me is really important. But then you say, well, what's it like to join? Mm-hmm. You know, and lose, I'll say it in the extreme form, you know, control, to lose, you know, because when you're part of a we, you're not the captain anymore. You know, you're a passenger on what can be an absolutely magnificent ride, or if you're terrified of not being in control, you just avoid joining, you know. And so part of what I hear you saying, Sue, is that, you know, in couples therapy, if you look at the deep nature of integration, yes, each member of the couple needs to be honored. Yes, we want them to learn to speak from the heart about what they need, for sure. And, so not instead, but and the experience of the we of that couple, in addition to the two me's that are there, needs to be, if it's not there, nurtured to grow. And what's that?
I wonder, Dan, I think I've heard you say that we heal in relationships.
Yeah.
And so the only way forward is actually leveraging our relationships for well-being.
Yeah, I think that's true. And whether it's in couples therapy like we're talking about, or the larger issues of cultural change, we need to be in community. I think there's a deep healing, Patty, as you're talking about it, and support that's going to come from us being in community. So whether it's reaching out to people and meeting with them regularly, or there's a group that I was speaking to in Baltimore called thread.org. Just check out what they do. They have people who don't know each other have dinner together. 10 people who never met each other have dinner together. And then I met with them as a large group, all the groups that had dinner with each other, and it was so beautiful because you realize people are just people.
That's a really cool idea to mix it up like that.
Yeah, I mean, you could start doing that in Austin. You could do it in any town. And listen, you can start living this right now because,
You hear that, audience? Wherever you are, wherever you're listening, in whichever country or state that you're listening, that you could create your own thread.
Yeah, you can thread it together and go to thread.org and see the beautiful work.
We'll put it in the show notes.
Yeah, and what's so exciting about it, and this is what I said to the folks in Baltimore, they inspired me so much. It is the idea of honoring differences and promoting these linkages in our relationships with each other. And the sad thing is, we live in a society, we get trained at home, we get trained in school, we get trained by society and science even, to think that we're all separate. But in fact, belonging is what we all have a longing for. And so we can turn this around. I mean, I'm not just being like overly optimistic. I really think that there's some very, very important, maybe challenging moves to make in our daily lives that can start having people feel this difference. When you look at another person and you realize that person is a manifestation of you. And it's like what I said at a high school recently, where there's all this competition. There's been a lot of suicides. It's so sad. And I said, look, if you're like a candle, and there's a candle to your right and a candle to your left, and neither of those candles is lit, and you lean over to the candle on your right and you light that candle, and then you straighten yourself up, and then you lean over to the candle on your left and you light up that candle. I said, what is it taken away from your flame to light up other candles? And the audience says, nothing. I said, and what does it do? And they said, it brightens the world. And that's the way we can live.
And it's such a beautiful, that's exactly right. And I think about where people get stuck, because you talked earlier about threat and then the feeling of loss of control when we move from me to we. Mm-hmm. And so I think about folks that are in a place of privilege and having to give, even having to recognize entitlements and privilege and all the things that they have to give up. Then the Jaws music is playing and there's something wrong. And there's not a feeling of, if I lean over, I'm just going to share something that I have freely. There's probably, I think, there's more a feeling of, I will lose my light, which adds to the threat. And I think, and then by them being threatened and giving off threat, then they threaten other people, right? And so it's more of they growl and then they get growls. So I like what you're saying in the sense that if that's part of what's happening, is just that people are feeling threatened and they need to feel safer, and then we can use our candlelight to reduce the people's anxiety and not see them as bad. Like you said, seeing each person as a reflection of yourself, that can begin to be part of turning that tide. Is that?
Yeah, exactly.
The gist of?
Yeah, exactly. And it is a different mindset, but I think it's going to be a win-win situation. Everyone's going to benefit from that, and it's part of why I encourage people to do this wheel of awareness practice from they can get it just download it from our website or stream it. You have people experience this kind of clarity of consciousness that allows the separate self to be respected, but opens you up to experiencing a very different way of sensing the world, not just even perceiving the world, of sensing it. And so this is, so we need to support that inner awareness. It can't just be done because someone told you to do it. Some kind of inner awareness, and I just think together, in interpersonal neurobiology, I think we got the science grounded. I mean, part of why I wrote Mind, the journey book, is we as a community, can just now see, here's where the science that says the mind is not just the single brain, the self is not just from your solo life. You are actually a part of something much larger than your skin encased body, which is from a science point of view, pretty outrageous thing to say, but, from a brain science point of view, at least,
Yes.
But we embrace the wisdom of anthropology and sociology that may be looking in those ways. So that's fantastic. But then put those two together and say, how do you actually make a difference in the world? And that's, really what we want to do in our field.
And that's a really optimistic view of what we can do.
Well, it concretely helps me and gives me something to take to people around a more compassionate understanding, and it has something to do with this when there's someone actively threatening perhaps your family, or that's in a position of power that is actively threatening, so that you don't just threaten back, so you're not just mirroring the threat, but it really provides a third option. And that's what I was really getting at, that it's like, that's where the hope is instead of threat, there's a way of rising above it. And as you said, sort of understanding what's going on in my body and then maybe perhaps the other person's body.
Exactly. And seeing people even in a position of power in the government, they're human beings too. And maybe they haven't had the insights yet about this connectivity, but they have that potential inside of them, and how we can bring that out in various ways. I think we can try to support the idea that we can bring positive changes into the world. I think it's, just a time of, challenge and bringing everything we've learned in interpersonal neurobiology and working together as a community that supports these basic human values and values of life. I think that's what we need to do.
Yeah, it's a great message to bring forward. And it fits kind of this whole idea of promoting security around the world. And that's what we want to do, is really promote secure relationships.
Absolutely. Totally.
So, Dan, thank you so much. It's really been delightful to get to talk to you.
Oh, Patty and Sue, thank you.
All right. Thanks for listening. You will find all sorts of references in our show notes to Dr. Dan Siegel's work and books. By the way, just going to www.therapistsuncensored.com would be awesome, because what's there and new for our season 3 is SpeakPipe. So you will see a little blue button. The minute you get on that site, it's a blue button. You push it and you can leave us a 90-second message that could be about this interview, or it could be about any of our prior episodes, or it could be about what you might desire to see in our 3rd season. You might even leave us a message that you could hear yourself live in the next season, because we love hearing from our listeners. So leave us a message. And we'd love it if you would go to your favorite podcast player and give us a rate and a review. Those always mean a lot to us. Thanks, and we'll see you around the bend.
Therapist Uncensored is Ann Kelly and Sue Marriott. This podcast is edited by Jack Anderson.